On December 18th, 1975, George and Kathy Lutz, with their 3 children, moved into 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville. 28 days later, they fled in terror. Both one of the most notorious and divisive supernatural cases of the 20th century, the Amityville Haunting has been called by believers one of the most terrifying true cases ever of haunting and possession by demons, yet also a great hoax, a horror story concocted over many bottles of wine. In today's video, we're going to delve into this hugely interesting case of a horrific mass murder, of a house that reportedly oozed evil, and the controversial account of the family who claimed to have been maliciously subjected to its terrors. This is the haunting true story of the Amityville Horror House. He loved those kids. He could never do it. Instantly recognizable for its original quarter-round windows that appeared strangely eye-like, 112 Ocean Avenue was located in the quaint village of Amityville in Long Island, New Jersey, a large Dutch colonial-style home built in 1927. It was charmingly ivory wood-paneled and had an expansive balcony. The house backed onto the idyllic Amityville River and was pleasantly christened High Hopes. Yet there was nothing idyllic nor pleasant about the grisly scene that greeted officers of the Amityville Police Department on the night of November 13th, 1974. The DeFeos family, Ronald Sr., his wife Louise, and their 5 children, Ron Jr., Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John, had high hopes for this new stage of their lives, having moved out of a cramped apartment in Brooklyn to this picturesque neighborhood. However, mob-connected, manipulative, controlling, and physically abusive to both his wife and children, Ronald terrorized his family all the same, beating them one minute and then consoling them the next. "We were like dogs on leashes," Butch recounted. "We were always beat up and abused by our father. It just went on and on." When interviewed in 1999, he recalled a horrific memory when he dropped his napkin at the dinner table, and after reaching down to pick it up, Ronald's sister asked calmly, "Why did you leave the table without asking permission?" Before picking up Butch by the throat and slamming him into the wall, then punching him until his face was a bloody mess. And when he got tired, he returned to his seat and proceeded to eat his dinner as though nothing had happened. The abuse, oppressive atmosphere, and constant family arguments became so severe that many of Dawn and Butch's friends refused to even enter the house, instead choosing to drink at their favorite bar, or loiter around Amityville, high on heroin, LSD, mescaline, quaaludes, or amphetamines, which both the siblings abused to lose weight. By his late teens, Butch had become a habitual drug user and petty thief, as well as displaying unpredictable ultraviolence, sadistic, and cruelly antisocial behavior like his father. Behavior that had him kicked out of school, having regular run-ins with the police, and only being able to find employment at his grandfather's auto shop, from which he also stole money frequently. On the night before the murders, a fierce argument reportedly erupted at 112 Ocean Avenue that saw every member of the DeFeos household being brutally punched, kicked, and slapped by Ronald Sr., starting with his wife and right on through to their youngest children. In a wild fit of self-defensive rage, Dawn grabbed a knife from the kitchen and threatened to kill her father, but was soon overpowered by both Louise and Ronald Sr. In the early hours of the 13th of November, Butch silently loaded his .35 caliber Marlin hunting rifle and crept from his bedroom on the 3rd floor downstairs to the floor where his family slept. Standing in the doorway of his parents' room, he fired 2 shots into Ronald Sr., hitting him in the kidney and spine before turning the rifle on his now barely awake mother, the 2 bullets striking her in the chest. Butch then proceeded next door to his brother's room and fired a single bullet into each of them, both in the back as they lay on their stomachs, before finally crossing to Dawn and Allison's room, where the rifle again thundered 2 times, killing the sisters with single shots to the head. Understandably, there has been contention amongst both researchers and police investigators as to how Butch managed to murder the other 4 members of his family without any of the victims hearing and/or reacting to the initial gunshots that killed Ronald Sr. and Louise. Neither did any neighbors report hearing gunfire that night, even though the shots would have been loud given the confined space of a bedroom. Law enforcement don't believe that a suppressor was used, and neither was anything discovered in the autopsy toxicology reports that would indicate the DeFeos had been drugged, leading many to theorize that there was actually more than one shooter, a claim that was also purported by Butch in 1986 when he accused Dawn of being the shooter of their father, whilst a distraught Louise then killed his siblings, forcing him to shoot her. And again in 2000, when he claimed it was actually himself, Dawn, and 2 other friends who carried out the murders before fleeing the scene. Through researching, we believe that the most convincing theory is that Butch's siblings actually did both hear and react to the gunshots, but in their slumbered state were either calmed down by their older brother, perhaps claiming it was a car backfiring, their neighbors, or heavy thunder, or even more chilling, that Butch confronted them with rifle. All of the victims were found lying face down, a position that would have been both painful and unnatural for Mark, who'd recently suffered a football injury and was confined to a wheelchair, as well as very coincidental for a family to all sleep in the same position. It's theorized that after killing his parents, Butch entered his brother's room to find them naturally startled, where he then forced them to lie down on their stomachs so he didn't have to see their faces, before firing the fatal shots, and then repeating the process in his sister's room. This would also account for the difference in killing shot placement for Dawn and Allison, who may have been more agitated or uncontrollable, given they'd just heard a series of 6 gunshots right outside their bedroom, and so were murdered instantaneously with shots to the head by a frantic and/or panicked Butch. However, this still doesn't account for the lack of noise heard by any of 112's neighbors. Let us know in the comments if you have any of your own theories on this. Seemingly calm and collected, Butch then bathed, trimmed his beard, and dressed in his casual workwear attire before stuffing the bloodied clothing, spent brass casings, boxes of ammunition and rifle inside a pillowcase. Driving into Brooklyn before sunrise, he disposed of the incriminating evidence down a storm drain and pulled into his grandfather's auto shop at around 6 a.m., where he completed his shift as though nothing was wrong. Throughout the day, he called home and feigned surprise when nobody picked up, telling anyone who'd listen that there was something strange going on, as no one was answering, and the cars had all been in the driveway when he'd left that morning, so the whole family should be in. A little after 6 that evening, Butch was drinking in Henry's in Amityville when he told his friend he was going to check in at home and make sure everything was okay. A short while after, he rushed back in, distressed and panicked, claiming, "You gotta help me! I think my mother and father are shot." A group of patrons from the bar scrambled into Butch's car and raced for 112 Ocean Avenue, where they entered to face the blood-spattered slayings. Outside, Butch appeared distraught, crying hysterically and banging his hands against the car, refusing to even enter the house. Upon confirming the murders, law enforcement took the apparent sole survivor into protective care after he made statements hinting that the killings were a sanctioned hit against his mobbed-up father, ordered either by Louise's father, Michael Brigante Sr., an associate of the Gambino crime family, or even by Ronald Sr.'s own brother, a powerful capo regime in the Genovese crime family, Peter DeFeo. Yet, despite these sensationalist claims, just one day later, Butch cracked under interrogation and confessed to the murders, admitting, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." In court, his defense submitted an insanity plea, relying heavily on Butch's traumatic upbringing. He denied the shootings 1 minute, but then, moments later, would respond, "As far as I'm concerned, if I didn't kill my family, they were going to kill me. What I did was self-defense, and there was nothing wrong with it. It felt good. I remember feeling very good." Ronald DeFeo Jr. was ultimately convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 terms of 25 to life, remaining incarcerated at Sullivan Correctional Facility, New York, until his death on March 12, 2021. Despite numerous appeals and melodramatic changes to his tale of what happened that fateful night in 1974. When George and Kathy Lutz moved into 112 Ocean Avenue on December 18, 1975, a little over a year after the DeFeos had been slain, the last thing they expected was to experience the scariest events of their young lives. George Lee Lutz, born January 1, 1947, was a Vietnam War veteran who'd served with the United States Marine Corps before returning home to New York to oversee William H. Perry Incorporated, a third-generation land surveying company owned by his family. Like many veterans seeking both a sense of camaraderie and the familiarity of brotherhood, George joined a boisterous motorcycle gang after the war, blazing up and down the East Coast on raucous rides and tearing through peaceful seaside towns. Over 6 foot tall and well-built, George was described by those who knew him as rough and ready, a combat veteran, karate and jiu-jitsu expert, and turbulent biker who wasn't given to flights of fancy, least of all, any supernatural phenomenon. And his children recalled he was always kind to us all. Kathleen Teresa Lutz was the mother to Danny, 9, Chris, 7, and Missy, 5, and was working as a waitress in a diner when she met George, who'd offered to give her a ride home after her car broke down. The pair instantly hit it off and married in 1975, with George then adopting the children as his own, and the new family of 5 seemed to have the makings of a happy home. In an effort to deal with his experiences from Vietnam, George had become heavily involved with the practice of transcendental meditation, a form of meditation that involves silently repeating a specific mantra for 15 to 20 minutes, twice a day, while sitting comfortably with the eyes closed, intended to allow the mind to settle inwardly and so reach a state of profound rest and relaxation. Kathy soon began to practice too, and the couple would set aside a specific portion of the day devoted to meditation. Interestingly, it's been proposed by some members of the family that this was the actual cause of the haunting, but we'll cover that in more detail later. With both George, 28, and Kathy, 30, having been married previously, they now looked forward to settling down and finding their forever home, a prolonged search that had taken them to view over 50 properties in just 4 months, before finally stumbling across 112 Ocean Avenue. The original 1974 listing advertised the house as exclusive to the Amityville area, 6-bedroom Dutch colonial, spacious living room, formal dining room, enclosed porch, 3.5 bathrooms, finished basement, 2-car garage, heated swimming pool, and large boathouse, asking $80,000. Confused as to the low asking price, the couple were convinced the house would be falling apart, or that the listing had missed a one before the 80,000 square feet, as it had been on the market for over a year, but when they went to view the property, they were pleasantly surprised. It was exactly what they'd been looking for. There was only one small thing to note, the estate agent announced. "This is the DeFeo house. I wondered if I should have told you which house this was before or after you saw it. Yet the Lutzes were unperturbed. They'd take it. Owning little furniture of their own, they chose to purchase some of the DeFeos that had been kept in storage since the murders, disconcertingly including such items as Ronnie's bedroom furniture, a little girl's playset, dining room set, and most disturbing, the bed frame on which Dawn had been shot and killed, which then became Missy's. Eerily, when they first viewed the house, and even when they moved in, bullet holes could be seen in the bedrooms where the DeFeos had died, as well as even bloodstains. But according to a family friend, George simply laughed these off, although he did take on board one friend's recommendation, that they ask the church to bless their new home. Neither of the couple were practicing their faith, so George contacted a Catholic reverend, Ralph Pecoraro, who dutifully agreed to drop by Ocean Avenue on their move-in day, Thursday, December 18th. And so commenced the Amityville Haunting. Arriving at the house in the afternoon, Reverend Pecoraro entered wearing his stole and carrying both holy water and Bible, and began to methodically recite prayers of blessing and protection, sprinkling holy water in each room. Walking into the newly appropriated sewing room, which had previously been the bedroom and murder scene of DeFeo brothers Mark and John, Reverend Pecoraro later recalled, "I was blessing the sewing room, and it was cold. It was really cold in there. I'm like, well, gee, this is peculiar, because it was a lovely day out, and it was winter, yes, but it didn't account for that kind of coldness. I was also sprinkling holy water, and I heard a rather deep voice behind me saying, 'Get out!' It seemed so directed toward me that I was really quite startled. I felt a slap at one point on the face. I felt somebody slap me, and there was nobody there." Despite this terrifying experience, the Reverend inexplicably didn't inform the Lutzes, instead hurriedly completing his ritual and bolting from the house, much to the surprise of George and Kathy, who wished to thank him with a gift of money, or even a bottle of whiskey, both of which he refused, rushing to leave the premises as soon as possible. On the return to his quarters at the Sacred Heart Rectory, Reverend Pecoraro then experienced a series of strange incidents. As he drove his car along the Van Wyck Expressway in Queens, New York, he could feel unseen hands forcing the vehicle onto the hard shoulder, despite there being no strong winds. Without warning, the bonnet of the car then slammed back against the windshield, blocking all vision, and one of the left side door's welded hinges tore loose, the door flying open and further adding to the dangerously high-speed chaos. Barely managing to pull off the road, the car stalled abruptly, leaving a shaken Pecoraro stranded and dazed. Calling a local priest via a roadside telephone, Pecoraro managed to hitch a lift back to the rectory and have a tow truck pick up his own car, which, even to the confusion of the mechanic, seemed to have no issues or faults that would have caused such danger. Finally home in his accommodation, the Reverend could not shake an overwhelming feeling of fretfulness and concern, but tried to brush this off as mere stress. Now believing himself to be safe inside the rectory, however, he was severely mistaken. In the weeks following the blessing, Pecoraro reportedly became violently ill. Appalling odors emanated only in his room at the rectory, and every time he tried to contact the Lutzes to warn them, the phone would either crackle and die, or emit disembodied groans so loud that he couldn't hear whoever was on the other end of the line. Unexplainable festering blisters also appeared on his hands, causing his palms to bleed and the skin to crack, but his physician's only answer was that it could be psychosomatic. Strangely, these mystery ailments only ceased after the Lutzes fled their new home. The Lutzes' first day inside 112 Ocean Avenue was uneventful. There was plenty of unpacking to be done, and the children enjoyed exploring their huge new residence, having moved from a small ground floor apartment to a sprawling 3-story home. Kathy and George sorted boxes of belongings into the family's soon-to-be bedrooms. They were in Ronald Sr. and Louise DeFeos' former room, while Chris and Danny were sharing Butch's old room on the 3rd floor, with the infamous quarter-round windows, the sewing room. Unaware that this was where Reverend Pecoraro had experienced the sinister voice, was to be Kathy's happy room, where she could escape for some peace and tranquility when life got a little too hectic. Before they retired to bed that evening, and weary from the day's work, George first chained the family's guard dog, Harry, a half Malamute, half Labrador Retriever cross, outside on a 20-foot steel lead. He lit a fire in the living room using packing cardboard and old scraps of wood in an effort to ward off the bitter chill that seemed to permeate the entire house, an innocent act that would soon spiral into a disquieting obsession. That first night, George was startled awake by a loud noise emanating from somewhere downstairs. Confused, he sat up and listened in silence, before again it sounded a distinct rapping on wood. It was somebody knocking at the front door. Concerned, he scrambled to find his pants and jacket when the rapping started again, yet this time it sounded from upstairs. Entering the room across the hall, which happened to be the sewing room, it was empty as expected, and he crossed to the window that looked out onto their boathouse and the Amityville River. Suddenly, something moved down near the boathouse, and George threw open the window, yelling at both the apparent intruder and also Harry, who was surprisingly quiet. A shout of, "Harry, go get him!" quickly alerted the dog, who sprang to its feet and began barking furiously, racing up and down the full length of the steel chain. Rushing downstairs, George picked up a length of discarded wood by the back door and exited into the freezing chill to confront whoever it was. Nearing Harry, the rapping sounded again, this time from the boathouse, and he again saw something moving around in the darkness. His senses now on full alert, and with the guard dog bellowing besides him, George approached the boathouse. Yet, there was nobody there. The door to the boathouse was open and swinging in the wind, despite his certainty that he'd locked it before going to bed. But other than that, there was nothing else amiss. Double-checking, there was nobody hiding on the property. George locked the door and returned to the house, confused but relieved. On December 23rd, whilst George was finalizing the move from his company's office in Syosset, New York, to a home office in a bid to save money, Kathy was busy organizing furniture and unpacking the myriad household paraphernalia, whilst the children entertained themselves downstairs in the newly christened playroom in the basement. In the kitchen, Kathy experienced something reach out and take hold of my hand. My only description for it was the touch of a woman, simply because I could feel a softness, but also an inner strength involved. Yet, when she informed George, they both decided it was simply due to overtiredness and the stress of moving in. Yet later that day, further strange phenomenon occurred. Rushing upstairs to her children's concerned cries, Kathy found the 3 of them in the bathroom, staring into the toilet bowl. The inside was completely black, as though painted, and remained so even after Kathy scrubbed it with bleach. Danny then shouted from down the hall, in her own bedroom, to say that the toilet there was black too. And when Kathy entered, the odor hit her, a Swedish perfume smell at first, and then an overpowering stench that smelled like a dead rat. Concerned, she called for George, and the couple checked the bathrooms on each floor, finding the same black stains in all of the toilets. When they checked the sewing room, on one of the windows, clinging to the inside of the pane, were literally hundreds of buzzing, swarming houseflies, despite it being the middle of winter and frozen outside. Disturbed, George opened the other window in the room and attempted to shoo the flies out, swatting a large number that refused to move and just sat there buzzing. before shutting the door and banning the children from going in. Yet just a few days later, he found the window wide open and even more flies were crawling on the glass. That same night, the 23rd, George was woken once again in the early hours by something and ventured downstairs to find the 250-pound wooden front door wrenched wide open, hanging from one hinge. The doorknob was twisted completely off-center, and the metal facing was bent back as though someone had tried to pry it open with a tool. But from the inside, somebody was trying to get out of the house, not in. Having lived in their dream home just 5 days, the Lutzes were considerably uneasy about the strange turn of events. However, they'd invested so much money into the property that they were determined to find answers to whoever or whatever appeared to be haranguing their family at whatever cost. Since his first night at 112 Ocean Avenue, a peculiar affliction had taken hold of George Lutz. He would awake inexplicably at 3:15 a.m. every night without fail, and some urgent feeling inside would drive him to wander the house, checking in each room and even venturing out to the boathouse in the bitter chill. December 25th was no different. And as George sat up in bed at 3:15, Kathy suddenly bolted upright and screamed, "She was shot in the head. She was shot in the head." I heard the explosions in my head. They would later discover that it was actually Dawn and Allison who'd been shot in the head. But at that time, the alarming vision only frightened the couple even more. Settling down once again, Kathy soon fell back asleep, but George once again felt the urge to roam the house, and he silently slipped out of bed. Creeping out to the boathouse, he reassured Harry that all was okay, and double-checked the troublesome lock on the boathouse door. As he went to return inside, a terrifying sight confronted him. He looked up at the house and stopped in his tracks. His heart leaped. From Missy's second-floor bedroom window, George could see the little girl staring at him, her eyes following his movements. "Oh God," he whispered aloud. Directly behind his daughter, frighteningly visible to George, was the face of a pig. He was sure he could see little red eyes glaring at him. "Missy!" he yelled, and the sound of his own voice broke the grip of terror on his heart and body. He ran for the house and pounded up the stairs to her bedroom, turning on the light. She was in bed, lying on her stomach, fast asleep. Beside the window that looked out at the boathouse, Missy's little chair was slowly rocking back and forth. Missy would claim that this was her friend, a pig named Jody, who would talk and play with her in her bedroom and who usually resided in the sewing room. During these 3:15 a.m. wanderings, George experienced a host of uncanny phenomenon, including the slamming of doors by unseen forces, phantom gunshots, and most bizarrely, hearing an entire marching band crashing through the living room downstairs, then finding all of the furniture pushed to one side as though they'd just paraded past. Paired with George's nocturnal activity was an unhealthy obsession with the roaring fireplace in the living room. He constantly complained about not being able to get warm, despite everybody else in the house feeling fine and the thermostat never dipping below 80 degrees Celsius. In their first week, he'd burned over 100 gallons of oil in the basement's burner and a month's supply of firewood. Kathy would find him either sat in front of the fire, staring into its flames, or outside incessantly chopping wood with an axe, practically refusing to help out with anything else like grocery shopping, household repairs, and even his office work, regardless of her frustration. Neither had he showered or shaved in the 9 days since their moving in, a fact that disturbed Kathy both as it was so out of character to his usually military-like grooming and personal hygiene regimen, and because he was due to act as her brother's best man at his upcoming wedding. All five of the Lutzes also underwent drastic personality changes over the weeks. The couple became irritable and antagonistic, whilst Danny, Chris, and Missy grew increasingly belligerent. George began to harass his wife, infuriating her with his lethargy and pugnacious attitude. Whereas before, he'd never even raised his voice at the children, George was now screaming at them for the slightest inconveniences and accusing Kathy of spoiling them like brats. As an adult, Chris recalled how George's temperament became quick to get pissed off and to express it. That became scary. During the 28 days that they lived inside 112 Ocean Avenue, the Lutzes would report a gradual increase in the level of paranormal activity. Kathy levitated in her bed, and later appeared to take on the horrifying form of an elderly hag. Visitors to the house would become violently ill or refuse to even enter. George claimed to glimpse Butch's face in the basement, and that same week, $1,500 in cash disappeared, never to be found. In early January, they claimed cloven-hoofed tracks appeared in the snow, walking around the house and up to the front door, and shortly after, the overpowering odor of bile and excrement permeated the house. Parapsychologists were invited to investigate and reportedly felt the presence of a woman, as well as witnessing a small boy sitting on one of the beds, asking them to help him. On the night that they left, January 13th, 1976, nearly all of the windows in the house were smashed during a turbulent thunderstorm. The beds in Danny and Chris's room slid and banged across the bedroom of their own accord. Drawers opened and shut in front of George and Kathy's eyes, and a chorus of voices, sounding like a huge crowd, could be heard emanating from downstairs whilst the family all cowered together in the same bed. At 7 a.m. on the morning of the 14th, the Lutz's resolve finally broke. As George scooped up an inexplicably unconscious Kathy to carry her out to the car, he turned to see a large, white-hooded specter stood at the top of the stairs, eerily pointing a finger at him. Terrified, he ordered Danny and Chris to grab their little sister and Harry, and all five of them fled 112 Ocean Avenue, leaving behind their personal belongings and furniture indefinitely. They had their lawyer sell the house at a considerable loss and auctioned off virtually everything on the premises, never again returning to 112 Ocean Avenue. In September 1977, American author Jay Anson published The Amityville Horror to international acclaim. Critics hailed it the scariest true story in years. Breathless, fascinating, and chilling, and more hideously frightening than The Exorcist, as this actually happened. The book sold over 11 million copies and was followed only a year later by a movie starring James Brolin and Margot Kidder, which grossed over $86 million and was, at the time, the most successful independent movie in history. The runaway success took the Lutzes by surprise, who found themselves being interviewed on the likes of the popular series In Search of, The 700 Club, and even Good Morning America. 112 Ocean Avenue, the DeFeos, and the Lutzes became household names, and the Amityville property became a hotspot tourist location, much to the frustration of its neighboring homes. Admittedly, the couple recalled that Jay Anson did take some creative liberties with their story, embellishing activity, omitting important facts, and inaccurately recording the actual sequence of events. The 1979 film took this even further, portraying George as slowly descending into homicidal mania, the walls weeping with blood, and claiming the house had been built on an ancient American Indian burial ground. Still, they maintained that enough had been captured in the portrayals that it was an adequate representation of the terror they experienced during those 28 days. But how much of their account, if any, was actually true? Practically as soon as the novel was released, many started to question the validity of the Lutz's story. Could it be proved? Were there any real witnesses other than the family? How much was fabricated by Anson? Where was the evidence of such sensationalist claims? One of the strongest proponents of the hoax theory was William Weber, Butch DeFeos' defense lawyer at his murder trial. Weber purported that it was actually he, George, and Kathy who'd concocted the story over numerous bottles of wine, either for purely financial gain or even more scandalously, to corroborate and support Butch DeFeos' insanity pleas. However, Weber could never actually provide any evidence of his allegations, not even notes, and the Lutzes filed an unsuccessful lawsuit against him in 1977 for misappropriation of names for trade purposes, invasion of privacy, and mental distress. Despite appearing on an episode of In Search of in 1979, a popular show that delved into strange phenomenon and unexplained mysteries, where he anonymously verified both the Lutz's account as well as retelling his own supernatural torment, Reverend Ralph Pecoraro would later go on to deny ever even having set foot inside 112 Ocean Avenue. Instead, he reported only to have had a single telephone call with George, during which they might have discussed some of the unusual happenings, but that was all. Similarly to Weber, in 2003, investigative journalist Rick Osuna published The Night the DeFeos Died, a reinvestigation of the Amityville murders, in which he also claimed the whole thing was a hoax, through which the Lutzes collected a substantial profit. Osuna contends that the hauntings were indeed dreamt up by the Lutzes and Weber as early as July 1975, before Butch was actually sentenced, and that George even wanted to know Butch's mannerisms and how he styled his beard and hair so that he could replicate it for the tale. Yet, Osuna's book has itself been called into question and is largely dismissed by serious authors and researchers. In it, Osuna claims it was actually Don DeFeo who murdered the children, whilst Butch and his friend killed Louise and Ronald Sr., a version related to him by an incarcerated Butch in 1999, and which Osuna took at face value, choosing to ignore the previous pattern of consistent lies and convoluted retellings. Even this interview itself was denied by Butch, who refuted ever speaking with the author. Further to this, most of Osuna's assertions are pure speculation, largely based upon the testimony of an elusive Geraldine DeFeo, who claimed to have been married to Butch at the time of the murders, and also be the mother of his child. Upon further investigation by critics, it transpired that Geraldine had indeed been married to DeFeo, but in reality, the two had not met until 1985, had married in 1989, and then divorced in 1993. Even in the face of such formidable skepticism, both Chris and Danny Lutz maintain that the hauntings were real, albeit sensationalized and highly exaggerated by their stepfather. In 2023, Chris appeared on a documentary investigating the haunting and subsequent family rift. In it, he proposed that George had actually invited, inadvertently or otherwise, an entity into their home through transcendental meditation. Recalling his youth, Chris believes that George was calling on things that weren't on the recommended list for transcendental meditation practitioners, instead practicing ominous activity, perhaps akin with witchcraft and the occult, that would have caused a haunting in any home. The boys would eventually fall out with George in later life and change their surnames after experiencing a turbulent and controlling youth due to their ill-found notoriety, as well as disagreeing vehemently with his blatant domination of a once true and traumatic experience that had overshadowed their childhood. Kathy and George would divorce in 1988, but until their deaths in 2004 and 2006, respectively, both continued to insist that something sinister had truly happened in that house. The Cromarty family, who moved in after the Lutzes in 1977, reported no paranormal activity during the 10 years that they lived at 112 Ocean Avenue, and neither have any of the residents who've lived in the property since. Today, the notorious house bears little resemblance to its former infamy. The distinctive quarter-round windows are gone. It's been hugely renovated, and even has a different address to deter inquisitive sightseers. Yet, the morbid curiosity, myriad unanswered questions, global notoriety, and contentious account of one family's terror keep the Amityville haunting prevalent and theories rife. Through deep diving into this complex and often perplexing legend, we hope we've managed to sway you either one way or the other, and would be interested in hearing your views in the comments below.